In 1987, late 1987, I was preparing for what seemed to be a pretty big year in my life. First of all, I was going to get married. And I was marrying the enemy. I was then a reporter for the Washington Post. I wasn't always at the New Yorker. I was a Washington Post reporter. I had been a feature reporter. And I was marrying someone on the other side. I was marrying an extraordinarily beautiful, talented, intelligent woman named Esther B. Fine, which is kind of like the Jewish cousin of Johnny B. Good. She used to carry her guitar in a gunny sack. And at this very same time, we decided we were going to go to Moscow. We were going to be in the opposite team's Moscow bureaus, and we were going to be enemies, journalistic rivals by day, and something else by night. But we had a very big task to accomplish first. We had to explain this idea to our families. And this was a particularly complicated thing. For one thing, Esther's grandparents had come from what used to be called the Russian Empire, and in horrible circumstances, exemplified by the fact that Esther's own mother spent the better part of her childhood in what's called a детский лагерь, a children's camp during Stalin's time. My own grandfathers, much more typically, had escaped the pogroms in around 1900 to 1905, and one step ahead of the Cossacks made their way to Ellis Island, which I now see out of my new window, and which Mary Norris is welcome to come in and see anytime she wants. And so among the tasks of persuasion that had to be accomplished, I decided, well, I have a grandfather that's 104 years old who had made the journey from Ukraine to Paterson, New Jersey to Miami Beach. And maybe it would be good to introduce him to Esther B. Fine. So we flew to Miami Beach because, by the way, when you're 104, no time is like the present. And we flew to Miami, and we knocked on his door on 61st and Collins Avenue, and he had a studio apartment at that time. He refused to go down to the pool because the women there were too young. They said they wouldn't understand his jokes because they were in their late 80s. They missed whole generational... He'd make musical references with balalaikas in them, and they wouldn't get them. I opened his refrigerator. There was a rye bread, pipe tobacco, a bottle of rye, and a container of chopped herring. It's what he called the essentials. It's all he needed. It's all he needed. And I said to him, you know, Grandpa, this is Esther, and we're going to get married very, very soon. And then we're going to study Russian one more summer, and we're going to move to Moscow. And he looked at me, and he said, you're not as smart as you look. He escaped Russia on a donkey cart, fleeing Cossacks, and his son, like a schmuck, was going to get on a plane and voluntarily, with his new bride, move to Moscow. He just, incomprehensible, and I'm afraid that's the last time we ever saw each other. So move we did. Move we did. Esther and I moved into a let us say, modest apartment. It made Co-op City look like something in those new towers that towering above Central Park. And it was absolute journalistic heaven. Every day brought a wonder. Every day brought more stories than you could possibly tell. Mikhail Gorbachev had pulled the plug on communist ideology. He'd pulled the plug on his own party. He'd ended the Cold War, no matter what they say at the Republican convention every 4 years. Everything was coming up roses. And it was a foreign correspondent story in which you weren't getting killed, which is always a benefit. You know, my brethren in foreign correspondence, my brothers and sisters in foreign correspondence, inevitably, the big story is horribly violent, horribly dangerous, And the code is, of course, you don't speak of these dangers to yourself, but they are there. But this really very, very rarely happened to us, if at all. And it was a marvel. And it went on for nearly 4 years. At the end of the 3rd year, we had a child, a baby named Alex. And after about close to 4 years, it was time to come home. It was time to come home because foreign correspondents cycle out. And we were getting a little disconnected from American life. I could no longer name the Yankee infield. There was a show called 30-something. We had no idea what it was. You begin to, all your friends now become Russian. At that time, there was no internet. A phone call cost $15 a minute, so you didn't make any. We didn't really have any contact with our old American lives. Very, very, very slight. So we were a little homesick. And about a week before we were scheduled to leave, in August of 1991, as a kind of journalistic goodbye gift, I got an interview with a man named Alexander Yakovlev. Alexander Yakovlev was like Gorbachev's Yoda, his good angel, his wisdom person. Like with Fred Flintstone would have on his shoulder a bad Fred and a good Fred. The good Fred was Alexander Yakovlev in this little drama. And I went to him, and he was already now out of power, but he was incredibly well-connected, needless to say. And we talked, and he said all kinds of interesting things about what was going on. And, the atmosphere was still fraught. The old elements of the KGB and the Communist Party and the army were still furious with Gorbachev. There was something brewing under the surface. And Yakovlev, not in direct terms, but subtly, said, in fact, there will be a coup d'etat. Gorbachev will be overthrown, the KGB and the party and the army will take over. He said it subtly, and I could only write it in a subtle way, but his message was clear, and there had been such messages before. So, we were scheduled to leave 5 days later. So, obviously, I canceled our tickets. Obviously, I came back and told Esther, look, you can't tell the New York Times, but we're going to want to be here. We changed our plans completely, obviously, right? Because I owned Russia. I knew the story. My instincts were incredible. I was really cooking with gas after 4 years. Bullshit. That's not what happened. What happened is we had heard rumors like this before, and we're leaving. And after all, it's time to go home. Our parents are expecting us. My parents were getting ill. Esther's parents were getting rightfully impatient to see their daughter. Not sure my parents cared very much, but it's okay. They loved me in their own way. I kid because I love. So we kept our plans. We kept our plans. And, it was this atmosphere. Tocqueville says that the most dangerous time for any regime is when it's liberalizing. So Gorbachev was as vulnerable as Louis XVI. But we had our plans. So what happened? On August 17th, we went on a picnic with our baby. We said goodbye to our very, very best Russian friends. We talked about what the future would bring for Russia. There would be democracy. There would be shopping malls. There would be Google. Had I known that, we would have bought stock. But we made all kinds of outlandish predictions. And the next day, we got on the plane. Alex, Esther, and I boarded the plane, exhilarated, relieved, eager to go home, a little sad. The baby, now a year old, was running up and down the aisle for 10 hours, smearing chocolate on everybody's sleeves, misbehaving terribly. Finally, we get to JFK. We're picked up at the airport by my in-laws, and we're taken to Muncie, New York, where they live. Muncie, New York, by the way, to most of you here, looks a little bit like 19th century Poland. It's a mix of modern Orthodox, Hasidic Jews, and other people. And we're at my in-laws' house, and we are absolutely exhausted. We eat dinner. Baby somehow gets to sleep at some crazy hour. And at about 11:30, just before collapsing into bed, or what I thought was going to be collapsing into bed, we turn on the TV, turn on CNN, and there are tanks going by our apartment building. Not another apartment building, our apartment building, number 7, Kutuzovsky Prospect, tank after tank after tank. And we didn't have the internet, we can't get full information, but it was clear what had happened. Tchaikovsky was playing on the radio in Moscow, never a good sign. Never a good sign. And there was a coup. That they had done it. Yakovlev had been absolutely right, and I and all of us had misread the signs or not read them sufficiently. And the next piece of news that came over the television, while I was thinking about how am I going to get back to Moscow the next morning, the next piece of news was there's going to be a hurricane on the east coast of the United States. And you could see already in Martha's Vineyard, the trees are absolutely parallel to the ground. Whoosh! And they're going to cancel all the flights. And please, if you have any wisdom whatsoever, stay in your house. So there was no way I could stay in my house, not watching this news. And we found a flight, a Lufthansa flight that would go to Europe, and then from Europe somehow get to Moscow. And at the same time, arranged for a local car service to get me to Kennedy Airport. Great. 6 o'clock in the morning, it is raining like the Bible. And a little bit more because it's Muncie, New York. It is raining like in the movie of Noah. And the car pulls up, and it's a 1967 Oldsmobile 98 with one of those chassis that's just swaying in the rain. And a little man comes out, more rabbinic than automotive, I would say. He was well over 4 feet. I stole that from Groucho Marx. He was well over 4 feet. He led me to the car, and he had 2 volumes of what seemed to be the Babylonian Talmud that he would sit on so that he could see over the dash. It could have been the Rockland County phone director, I have no idea. And in this hail, windstorm, rainstorm, hurricane, we drove and drove. Of course, there was still traffic on the Van Wyck. Unaccountably. We make it to Kennedy Airport, and I figured one of 3 things is going to happen. The flight is going to be canceled. We're going to get killed driving here in the airport because the guy can't see anything. And if I manage to get to Moscow, there'll be tanks at Sheremetyevo Airport, and I'll be arrested or turned back, and it'll be impossible to do anything. What happened? What happened was the one flight took off with me on it and about 9-10 passengers. It landed in Frankfurt, Frankfurt to Moscow. Moscow, there was nothing. The effect was as if I had overslept. I was gone, I hadn't been gone so long, I wasn't even jet-lagged. I get to the office, there's tanks everywhere. I say to the office driver, Volodya, can you imagine what's going on? It's insane. And the driver says, yes, David, this is terrible traffic. Terrible traffic. I said, Volodya, they took over, Gorbachev is in prison. Whatever, I don't care. Went to work, and by the next day, a coup that had looked like an episode in The Brothers Karamazov had ended like a day at the races with the Marx Brothers. A complete catastrophe in which the coup plotters were all drunk, their hands were shaking at their press conference. People, tens and hundreds of thousands of people, rallied around what's called the White House. It was the most uplifting thing I've ever seen in my life that was of a political nature. It was glorious. And 2 nights later, Gorbachev returned to Moscow from his vacation house where he had been imprisoned. It's my dream to be imprisoned in a vacation house. And it all seemed terrific. I stayed on and off for the next few months. I'd go back and forth. And on Christmas night, 1991, the red flag with a hammer and sickle was lowered over the Kremlin for the very last time. And like a story in the Moth, the story seemed to be over. The historical episode that had begun in 1917, seemed to be over once and for all. The great vista of encroaching democracy, a market that made some sense to the economy would begin. People would be able to maintain free speech. A certain amount of civic safety would ensue. And I was thinking about this story because today, on my way over here, I got the news that maybe you've got. It turns out that what was really happening in 1991 and into the 90s was a mid-level KGB lieutenant colonel was slowly making a name for himself. And the institutions that really persisted were the institutions that never went away, that were never destroyed by 1991, and we had gotten the story, in a sense, wrong again. And as I came over here tonight, I got the following news, that Boris Nemtsov, one of the really important opposition politicians in Russia, who had stood up to Vladimir Putin with all his strength, was murdered on the streets not 6 hours ago tonight as he was walking 50 yards from the Kremlin. So what happens is stories never end. Real stories never end. Political stories never end. And the work of what we're supposed to be doing as reporters and as citizens goes on and on. Thank you very much.